Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome, a very warm welcome to everyone. It's nice to see you and have you with us here for our webinar today. My name is Holger Lenz. You may have seen my name in emails that come through community channels. I'm the DSpace program coordinator, and I'm very happy to welcome Aaron, Yu-Chen, and Steve today here from the University of Massachusetts Amherst Libraries for our webinar. Before we get started, I'm just going to share a couple of housekeeping items, and then I'll hand off to Aaron, Yun-Chen, and Steve. So this webinar today is part of the DSpace Deep Dive series. So the DSpace Deep Dive series is a new initiative for the community. If you haven't heard about it, you've got the link here on the slide. It's DSpace on the dspace.org website/webinars. Go ahead and check it out. It's basically the idea is that we have webinars from the community for the community. So anything that is of interest to the community, such as a migration story that we have today, features that you may be using, specific features. One of the upcoming features that we want to highlight is, for example, the Matomo integration, other features as well, or customizations that you have built in your DSpace repository, anything that could help the community to learn more about DSpace. That's the idea of this webinar series. So if you haven't seen it yet, go ahead and check it out. And if you're interested in presenting, you find a form on this website, on the dspace.org/webinar website, where you can sign up to present as part of this DSpace deep dive webinar series. Feel free to also just email directly to info@dspace.org. You don't have to fill out the form. If you have any questions or comments, you can get in touch with us as well through that. So the only other couple of things I wanted to mention before I hand the microphone over to the presenters today is the chat function in Zoom has been disabled. So you are not able to use the chat function for questions that you have. So we'll have a part of today's webinar is a presentation, and then we'll have also a question and answer session. So any questions that you have and that come up, please use the Q&A functionality. You find the Q&A button. You should find the Q&A button. I don't currently see it here. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, it was just hidden for me. But you have this in the taskbar on the bottom of your Zoom window. So please use that to ask any questions that you would like the presenters to answer. And then also that just letting everyone know that this is a recorded session and that the recording will be made available later after today's webinar. So that's just a couple of housekeeping items from my end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will hand it over to Aaron, Yu-Chen, and Steve.
All right, thanks. And now I will share my screen. All right, so thank you for having us today. I'm grateful to be joined by the two colleagues who work with me to manage and support ScholarWorks, Steve Bischoff and Yuntian Hu. Steve was an integral member of our small but mighty migration team, and Yuntian has been an invaluable asset in helping with batch API processes since we went live on DSpace. And I think that this is one of the really nice outcomes of our migration, is that we formed this informal DSpace team. So we've divided today's talk into two parts, pre-migration and post-migration. You'll be hearing just from me in the first half, and I'm sorry about that, because the development of our migration plan was my sabbatical project in 2023. So a brief roadmap of what we'll be covering in part one today. So here's an overview of our project timeline. ScholarWorks at UMassAmherst was launched in July 2006 on bepress's Digital Commons. But after the Elsevier acquisition of bepress, I began really pushing for a migration to leave the platform, to go to an open source, community-led platform. It took a while to get permission to pursue that, but I finalized our platform choices in January 2023, and then I went on a 6-month sabbatical in which I developed our migration plan. We migrated from Digital Commons to two separate platforms, Janeway-hosted Janeway for our active peer-reviewed journals and Atmire-hosted DSpace for everything else. We had determined that DSpace's journal entity did not provide our editors with the required functionality that they were used to in Digital Commons. So that's just for those of you who are publishing journals in Digital Commons. That was what we chose to do. So we were Atmire's first migration from Digital Commons to this version of Open Repository, their customized hosted version of DSpace 7. We began the migration simultaneously with the expectation that the Janeway migration would be completed well before the really intensive repository migration work started. The migration would only grab published and digital content speak posted content, so we chose a content freeze date about 8 weeks from our intended go live. We turned off submission forms for every collection with the exception of our ETDs, which I'll discuss later. And here's where we learned that if a submission link existed in an email or was findable somewhere on the web, it still worked, which was a really horrible surprise. So we were still seeing a very small number of non-ETD submissions during our content freeze. Because of our timeline, we had to be off Digital Commons by the end of June 2024. We went live on a slightly earlier version of DSpace than we'd intended. And at that time, we thought we'd still have access to Digital Commons via the underlying URL, but that was not the case. We asked bepress if we could still access it since our license hadn't expired, but they would only create a new accessible URL if we paid them, so we just left Digital Commons behind. In September of 2024, we upgraded to our intended version of DSpace and began to set things up for self-submission, eventually turning that on in October once we finished setting up single sign-on. And the issues we encountered with single sign-on setup were solely UMass-based and nothing to do with Atmire or DSpace. So here's what we knew about ScholarWorks going into our initial discussions with Atmire. We needed the size of audiovisual components because we were adding on Atmire streaming module. Our dean at the time had given us permission to pursue full custom DSpace, but Open Repository, essentially the mid-tier version that Atmire offers, met all of our functional requirements. We opted to migrate only our archived and inactive journals to DSpace as journal entities, so these 11 publications listed here were excluded. And 58,000 items doesn't equal files. Each item might have multiple files, or as DSpace calls them, bit streams. So during my sabbatical, I conducted interviews with IR managers who had recently migrated from Digital Commons, primarily to DSpace, but also to other platforms. And these were the high-level takeaways that contributed to the development of our migration plan. And I'll touch more on hidden items later. Mapped items were indicated in the Digital Commons content inventory report, but this is not represented in the metadata. And description fields for supplementary files didn't migrate, but should have been visible in OAI PMH. Folks who had migrated to earlier versions of DSpace had encountered hiccups with embargoes not migrating. This ended up not being an issue for us, but we prepped as though it would be. And collection level metadata, community and collection level descriptions, we knew wouldn't migrate, so we collected all of those externally. So we kept things as static as possible during the migration. We were so committed to our organization by structure by college, school, department, type of publication that it ended up being easier to mirror in DSpace. We didn't have the ability to delete or withdraw posted content in Digital Commons, so we provided bepress with lists of duplicate items to be deleted. Unfortunately, a prior batch import had ingested a large number of duplicate items that had never been removed. Spoiler alert, we ended up migrating all of the metadata-only items for political reasons because we were concerned that departments would see that their collections had shrunk in size and that ended up being kind of a sensitive issue. So we treated our migration plan as a living document. And just to note, if you intend to continue supporting your publishing program, anything related to peer review, such as lists of reviewers and reviews themselves, won't migrate. So you have to save that content externally, separately. Our students submit directly to the IR, and our content freeze and go live dates were going to impact May and September degrees. So we wanted to limit disruption as much as we could. And we created a page in our ScholarWorks LiveGuide and emailed collection administrators, but as expected, we didn't reach everyone. So there were folks for which the migration was a complete surprise, despite our outreach efforts. So this was work that I tried to finish prior to the start of our migration in the spring of 2023. We kept getting corrupted files for content inventory reports, and bepress's tech team would iterate through the report, emailing each time they encountered special characters, which were mostly in the abstracts that I would then remove. I gave bepress permission to delete the 2,279 author item. And in terms of the metadata only items, again, most of these were from a batch harvest pilot with the idea that someone would go back later and attach PDFs. Items were uploaded into multiple collections instead of using Digital Commons collection tool like DSpace's mapping tool. And items also included incomplete metadata. I removed the duplicates, and I think the record was one item that had been uploaded to 6 different collections. And I created a spreadsheet to track these later, but as I already mentioned, we kept them. In terms of the items with 50 plus authors, those could only be edited manually. The number of authors exceeded the author columns included in the Digital Commons batch revised spreadsheet. And if these items were in collections where the upload of a file was required, my deletions would trigger an error when I tried to update the item, and Digital Commons would add all the authors back to the record again. So I had to have bepress turn off the required files for those collections. We did not have Amazon S3 for institutional reasons that are beyond the scope of this talk, but I wanted to be sure to catch all hidden collections and hidden items ahead of time to ensure they wouldn't be migrated. And after 6 months, I was able to get a report from bepress that listed all hidden structures, but not hidden items. And I asked bepress to withdraw everything in these collections, working under the assumption that this content would somehow migrate regardless of its hidden status. And once we got access to our S3 bucket with Atmire, it became clear that hidden items and hidden structures weren't exported. So this was a wasted effort. Hidden primary items are not indicated in Digital Commons metadata, but hidden supplemental files appear in content inventory reports in brackets. And in many cases, these were just random files that users had submitted, but because we didn't have the ability to delete them, we would just hide them. I identified all of these hidden files and asked bepress if they could delete them ahead of our migration, and they said no. So we gave up on this and ultimately had a student delete them once we went live on DSpace. And our author list has been on my to-do list since I got to UMass in 2016. All variations of author names, add an individual author to the author list. And this was something that I couldn't really manage in Digital Commons because if an email address was included, I could not merge 2 users, only bepress could. So this is now on my to-do list for this year. We have 2 trustee student assistants who will be working on standardizing our author names. And in terms of items that link out, we had been bepress expert gallery suite users, and occasionally our authors had linked out to items on their profile pages instead of uploading them to Digital Commons. So whenever possible, I replaced those link outs with a downloadable file. So here's just a before and after view of those multi-author items. So this is about 50 plus authors, just to show you what we were dealing with in Digital Commons. And this is what they looked like cleaned up. I made multiple attempts to begin metadata mapping to Dublin Core early in the process, and I began trying to pull all custom fields from the Digital Commons Content Inventory report and the bepress API, but that required a lot of guesswork. The metadata snapshots pulled using the API showed a lot of columns just named configured field and a letter. And it turned out that they didn't always represent custom fields. And our instance of Digital Commons was so old that some fields that were initially custom became standard in current versions. Not all metadata fields were available through either version of bepress's API either. So I couldn't do a call that said, show me every item that uses a specific field. At this point, we learned that we needed to re-index Digital Commons because the API was pulling in all sorts of deleted and no longer existing items. So while we waited for a full list of all used metadata fields in ScholarWorks, Atmire sent us their standard digital commons to Dublin core mappings. And we relied on that combination of recommended fields plus recommendations from folks at Cornell, UMass Chan, and Washington University in St. Louis, who had shared their mappings with me during my sabbatical. I will also say the Digital Commons content inventory doesn't show you fields that are suppressed from the front end either. So there was a lot of back and forth between spreadsheets and Digital Commons during this stage. And once we completed our preliminary mappings in December of 2023, we opted to just say they were good enough and moved forward with them in the interest of time. So this screenshot shows you some interesting things that we encountered at this stage. In the screenshot on the left, the second ISBN field mapped to something called identifier, and the blank ISBN field mapped to a field called ISBN. In the screenshot on the right, we have a few different things happening. Author biography is actually our acknowledgements field. The acknowledgements field is actually a field labeled acknowledgements_2. And there were two fields for DOI, neither of which are being used, and we didn't understand why they were both here. So some lessons learned here before I turn things over to Steve. These are not necessarily recommendations for a happy and easy migration, but they're things that I'll keep in mind as our IR continues to grow. We had a lot of empty structures in Digital Commons, and these were either collections we created before talking to a specific department or cases where our contacts just vanished and discussions ended. And this has made me maybe a little more conservative when it comes to taking on new collections, but I really need to gauge whether there's full buy-in from all parties involved and whether or not we can do something, in the repository that's not forcing square pegs into round holes. And so now, post-migration, and a brief roadmap of what we encountered and will be talking about for this half.
So, thanks, Erin, for talking about the plan and the great plan you came up with. And then the migration happens, right? So we had initially working with Atmire, we had a test system where we did kind of a test migration early in 2024. And basically brought over all the items. So we had a copy of all metadata and documents that were moved into an S3 instance by Atmire. So they kind of scraped the Digital Commons site and brought over all the metadata and all the bit streams. As Erin mentioned, the structure of communities and collections in DSpace don't migrate, but we had kind of a list of those that we gave them to put into the test system. And a number of the things fell out in between. So we had a default collection, which then could hold orphaned items. And that helped us refine kind of the mapping between our new community collection structure versus the one we had in Digital Commons. So all the metadata and all the files were loaded, and that was great. We compared the numbers and they seemed to match pretty much, both when we did test and then when we did the production system. We really saw that it really filled out the collections as we expected. Next slide. So the first thing that we wanted to do is redirecting all our old Digital Commons URLs. So we kept the same host name. We wanted to keep the host name scholarworks.umass.edu, but we did migrate all the old context keys, which is the key that was in Digital Commons, and the URL that was used in Digital Commons into the DSpace item metadata. So these old URLs we were able to use these to create, Atmire was able to use these to create a list of redirects, which redirected the old URLs to the item level records in DSpace. There's an example below, as you can see in the middle of the screen, the scholarworks.umass.edu. There was a math faculty pubs. That was the name of a collection in Digital Commons, and then the context key for a specific item. And of course, this translates then into a new DSpace URL, which has a UUID. So we checked a list of all the URLs. We manually checked and updated a bunch of them for the collections. And provided Atmire a list of all our collection names and then what the collections would be in DSpace. So we were able to then map the collection levels, which was basically like math faculty pubs would then translate to a collection or a community within DSpace. So that all worked pretty well. The big hiccup that Aaron mentioned is when we switched the host name, we no longer had access to bepress, which came to a shock the day that happened. We knew there was an underlying URL, but it wouldn't resolve. And Digital Commons at the time said, if you want to do this, this would cost you some extra. So at that point, we effectively lost access to our bepress system. Next slide. So we had a lot of DOIs for a bunch of items, and they pointed to the old URL. And this worked great because the old URLs were being mapped by the redirects that Atmire created. And that seemed to be working pretty well. But fairly early in the process after we migrated, this is where our help from UNTN came in. We started doing batch updates using the DataSite API. So in chunks of it, we would go update the records in DataSite. Since we had the old URLs in the metadata record, we could find the old URL, find the DOA, and put the new DSpace URLs into our DataSite records. And that was completed pretty much in the first 6 months after it, going through various records where we had DOIs. And thanks to UTN for doing this, and it worked pretty well. Next slide. So when we went live, this was probably when AI was taking off and trying to consume the internet. So we knew Google would need to reindex the site, and it looks to be complete at this time, and Google Scholar, and these are things we were interested in. But there were lots of other bots crawling this site constantly, and it caused, especially early on, some serious performance issues. We used to see this white label page error quite a bit in kind of the summer of 2024 and the beginning of the fall. Just based on, I think, the amount of traffic that the site was getting at the time. Atmire worked with us and gave us lists of sites crawlers they thought would be appropriate to block, and had other strategies for kind of trying to mitigate the amount of traffic coming from bots to the site. And gradually performance has improved. And our Google indexing, for the most part, Google seems to be complete. We can check things in the Search Console and so on. And for the most part, things appear correctly now in Google Scholar, even though that's a bit of a black box on when and how they re-index things. The one thing we haven't done yet is testing OAI PMH harvesting. Previously, we had in our local discovery index a listing of our records, and that's something we're hoping to recreate soon. Next slide.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we kept submissions turned on for our ETDs because we didn't want to cause any additional stress for students who are graduating in May. We'd agreed to hold off on redirecting our ScholarWorks URL to DSpace until the graduate school basically gave us the thumbs up. And the deadline for May students was April 22nd. I don't know why that was so hard to say. But there are typically many stragglers throughout the month of May, so we had to keep pushing back our redirect. The formatting review we agreed would be conducted externally through shared tracking spreadsheets and folders in OneDrive. So the student would submit, and Steve and we had divided up dissertations and theses, and one of us would pull the PDF and the pertinent metadata out of Digital Commons. And we eventually uploaded the May degrees via a batch upload using SAF Creator this past October. And we all thought we'd have a nice lull before, having to deal with September submissions. But we began getting questions the day we launched DSpace, and I am not kidding. I wish I were kidding, but I'm not. So we had to think fast because single sign-on wasn't set up, self-submissions weren't set up. So we created a Microsoft form replica of the submission form, and students had to submit their ETDs this way. And we even had some really eager February 2025 graduates who were submitting. So luckily, February 2025 degrees, aside from those few who were submitting in June, were the first group to self-submit directly to DSpace.
So the great thing is we brought all the metadata over. The weird thing is we brought all the metadata over. We discovered a number of odd fields when looking at the metadata that was brought over. In Digital Commons, there was a hidden additional field, basically a type field called article, and every single item had a type field called article. It didn't matter what it was, if it was an article, an ETD, if it was a video, if it was data. They all had an additional type field of article that was brought over. And you can see over on the side there, here's an example of a thesis that has a type open. It's an open access item. It's a thesis, but it also added in the article. We also realized that the dates were not in DSpace friendly kind of ISO formats. A lot of the dates were in plain text, so those needed to be edited over time. And that's something, again, UTN was able to go using the DSpace API and kind of finesse some of the dates so that they would work properly in DSpace. Advisor names all came over as a single string, which became an adventure. So it was just, the advisor name would be John Smith or, and so on. So we needed to split the advisor names on what we assumed were, last name, first names, and then the adventure of middle initials and were the initials part of the last name or prefixes to last name. So we had a number of kind of rather complex regular expressions to kind of evaluate all those, and those seem to have worked out pretty well. And any field that existed, it arrived. So we still are finding some strange little extra fields here and there, but it's good that it's all there. We can evaluate it and then either, suppress it or delete it. I'll talk some more about there's a strange way that bepress let you bulk upload things, but it stored the URLs as a S3 string. And then there was all that HTML that Digital Commons lets you create as part of a record. Next slide. So this all came over as HTML, but not HTML that's rendered. So this is in a description field, and you can see that there is, paragraph markers for HTML. If any of you have worked in bepress, the magic tag, it was commented out by somebody and so on. So this is all appearing in our tags. So we've had cleanups to kind of correct some of that. Additionally, we've had some discussions with, next slide, please. With Atmire, because there are places we would like to have some HTML markup, but HTML and other things like math jacks are frequently desired by users. But of course, this creates impacts for harvesters. They might not be expecting markup tags within stuff they're indexing. And of course, there's a security impact if you allow coded things. It's a vector for code or script injection. So Atmire is working on a high-level plan for markup support going forward that would allow certain fields to have markup. It would enforce that markup could only be entered in those specific fields. And so these fields would then be looking for the markup and then sanitize and guard these fields and only allow specific tags so you don't have some of the security issues, but you can see markup being used. So that's something we're looking forward to. Next slide. I mentioned strange file names. So in bepress, there was a bulk upload feature where you could upload a bunch of items and upload their bit streams, and it was stored in S3, and then it magically, you clicked a button and it all moved it over into your instance. But when we migrated the files, the file names came across as these very long, strange things. And if you look at the one on the lower right-hand side, you can see 4_20, a date, Lynn, a name, and then it's an MP4. So this is an MP4 file, but it has all this other AWS access keys and other keys and expiration dates attached to it. And of course, when a user would click on this, it wouldn't get anything. They would get an error. But we figured out that you can go right where it says MP4 underscore, or you'll see some of the other ones have PDF underscore. If you go right to those kind of PDF underscores and delete the rest of it and save that as the file name, then the files would behave appropriately in DSpace and users could download. So the files themselves weren't damaged. We just had these strange file names, which again, we had to go back in and clean up. Next.
Okay, and what we recently discovered this summer is that if anything was imported into Digital Commons with a direct download link, a lot of those files ended up being corrupted too. You'll have .pdf underscore DL underscore 0 or DL underscore 1. And those also we have to go in and clean up. And then as soon as you change the file name and remove that little extension, they download again. But we hadn't seen any of that during testing. So that was a fun surprise. And I think there are about 1,000 of those lurking throughout the repository for a rather old archived collection. So in terms of embargoes, our students have a lot of options for controlling access, and this is part of our negotiations with the grad school when we were leaving ProQuest. We couldn't set up campus access until go live because it relied on single sign-on. The idea was all UMass users would log in, be added to an all UMass group, and have access to the PDF, whereas any unaffiliated users could request a copy. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, single sign-on took a very long time to set up on production, despite our setting it very quickly on tests. So this held up our ability to turn on both self-submissions and campus access. As I mentioned earlier, people I had talked to during my migration prep had said that their embargoes hadn't migrated. Atmire had assured us that they would, but we had the additional complication of those campus-only items, so we opted to preemptively embargo everything until June 2029, just to be safe. And we thought this would buy us time in terms of figuring out how to set up access restrictions in DSpace after many conversations with Atmire and other users regarding manual oversight and default policies. And this might seem maybe we were overthinking things a little bit, but we didn't have access to this level of control in Digital Commons. This was something bepress would just set up for you. So this was maybe I think the hardest thing for us to set up. I still have a whiteboard with all of our ideas sitting next to me here. I can erase it now, I think. I think we're good. But we had the decision to preemptively embargo everything had unfortunate ramifications. Students whose work had previously been open access panicked because they suddenly couldn't download their work. And the built-in request forms were sending requests to some unknown inbox. So we were getting email complaints that no one was responding to requests. We wanted to keep the request form functionality, but also do a better job of distinguishing between truly embargoed content and campus-only content, which is requestable. And we wanted to lift embargoes quickly. We had about 13,000 items that needed to go back to being fully open, but we went live on a version of DSpace that lacked batch embargo removals through the UI. So we had a few solutions. One was a crowdsourced lifting project, and that was dual purpose. It was outreach about ScholarWorks to staff who don't really work with it. And it gave folks work during the summer lull. And it was just too many items for just me and Steve to lift. Thankfully, Yoon Tian wrote a script to lift all remaining preemptive embargoes when we just realized, even with the crowdsourced project, it just felt like an uphill battle. And using DSpace's very granular embargo options, we chose to embargo at the bundle level for actual embargoes and then create access for the UMass user group at the bitstream level for campus-only items. And again, this was a lot of trial and error for us. But this is what it looks like in practice. And we'd wanted to do something with as little manual oversight as possible. We floated the idea of making everything campus only by default and lifting those that weren't, but that was still too much manual work in the long run. So this screenshot is what we opted to do. So in this case, this is a student who has a 1-year embargo and then 5 years campus access. Some of our students really don't want anyone to see their work for the longest time possible. So this is what it looks like from the user perspective. So on the left, there is an embargoed item. There's no file visible to end users at all. This is something we ran into a lot with Digital Commons, where folks couldn't understand why they couldn't access something that was embargoed. And we added an embargo lift date to our default simple view using a custom field against, we had to create a custom field. So we went with dc.description.embargo. And we hoped that this would make it clearer to users when a file would be available. I think in a future version of open repositories, the embargo lift dates will appear automatically, but they weren't for us. So on the right is a campus-only item, and a non-UMass user will see that lock icon and will be taken to the request form if they click the PDF. It turns out most UMass users are not logging in either, so we're just granting requests from any user at this point. And we also decided to make our dc.type field more granular for end users so that a campus access item will show that as a parenthetical under type in the simple view.
One of the things we are working on and knew we'd have to work on is rebuilding mapped collections. So the previous system used mapped collections for a wide variety of collections. And DSpace also supports these mapped collections. So the idea of a mapped collection is a great example is we have all our dissertations in one giant dissertation collection, yet a lot of departments want departmental dissertation collections, so we collect all the history dissertations and map them into a history dissertation collection, or we map all the public health dissertations and map them into a public health dissertation that the departments can point to. So we made no attempt at trying to convert this or keeping the data. They're just being recreated over time as we see fit. Next. Things that should not have migrated. This was, again, one of those kind of surprises. As we said, Atmire collected everything from Digital Commons and then brought everything over. So all those journals we migrated to a different system, basically into Janeway, also migrated into DSpace. So that was a little bit of a surprise. We were able to go back and try to suppress or withdraw them in different ways. We then discovered that if Google indexes the actual bitstream level item, they're still findable. So we were seeing in our statistics, people were finding some of the journal articles that are in our Janeway system, in our ScholarWorks DSpace system, based basically on Google links. Also, hidden collections, the items that were in some of the hidden collections that we had suppressed in Digital Commons, the actual items appeared. And again, Google was good at finding these things. So anytime Google found a PDF to something that was hidden or somewhere else, people were still accessing it, even though the item was withdrawn, they could still find the bitstream. So this has been a process of fully withdrawing those sorts of items. Next.
Okay, so how do you manage expectations during a migration? It's difficult. It's hard to reach all users. Emails don't necessarily work. They don't all read LibGuides. So I fully acknowledge it's just we did the best that we could. At this point, we've resolved the why can't I submit. We ended up copying the Colorado School of Mines setup and created one central collection for non-ETD and non-data self-submissions. For those of you who are Digital Commons users, self-submissions, a user had to know exactly which collection they needed to submit to because you couldn't move an item to a new collection after submission. It really reduced our numbers of self-submissions unless they were absolutely required. And all I could do was reject something if someone submitted to the wrong place. So we really wanted to keep things simple for users and create one central collection. During the freeze, we were utilizing a separate Microsoft form for non-ETD submissions. And again, like so few self-submissions from non-grad students, but of course, the minute we turned off submissions, folks wanted to submit, which is very nice, but it meant we had to kind of scramble to think of like where to put things while we waited. And to date, we've seen a modest uptick in non-ETD self-submissions, which confirms our decision to go to DSpace. It's an easier user experience for self-submissions. Why is this site so horrible? I couldn't believe just the absolutely nasty emails I got from people who did not realize that a human being was reading emails on the other side. And I think this was a lot to do with folks didn't understand kind of how to find all of our communities and collections when we first went live, and a lot of our performance issues initially. Since our performance issues have been resolved, the nasty emails have subsided, thankfully. And we have developed our talking points about the benefits of going to an open source platform. Our redirects are fully functional at this point, although we do occasionally find some that have slipped through the cracks. So we keep a list and we correct those as we find them. And we still have some orphaned content in a hidden collection. And we're trying to figure out where that content should go, because it just strange things. When you migrate a very old system to a new system, you're constantly unearthing fun surprises. And that could be a whole other presentation of fun things we discovered during this process.
And I'll touch on migrating digital commons stats. So bepress had no API kind of for the full export of their statistical data. So Atmire his method was to scrape the pages and capture the data downloads. And so this gave us at least data on the date, time, and the number of downloads that various items had. But users were a little, we're used to digital commons as kind of nice statistical displays and nice email updates. So that's something that's been missing. Going forward, the DSpace stats have been coming in, and they've been coming in with, at least initially, had lower than normal, lower than what people had been expecting for amount of downloads for things that were downloaded a lot. And a lot of that was, things being moved to a new site, or people may have had certain bookmarks. And as things got re-indexed in Google, we've been seeing a slow uptick in our usage stats. And overall, we've been telling people with their usage stats that, you can look at your digital common stats and see how much it got used before the new system. And if you want to look at more granular stats, you now have a year plus worth of DSpace stats. You can kind of look at that going forward and realize that there's a break between the two numbers, and they are slightly different. Next.
So some loose ends and unresolved issues. We anticipate that the streaming module will be ready this year. We're testing selective DOI minting functionality. We only want to mint DOIs for specific collections such as ETDs, data, and working papers, basically items that wouldn't have any other identifier. Connecting authors with their author profiles, the DSpace people entities, and or their ORCIDs is kind of low on our priority list. We've developed some complicated workarounds for the ORCID piece, but we're really doing this kind of on demand for users. We're not quite sure how we're going to use the people entities yet, because our campus has been discussing implementing their own CRIS for, I don't know, almost the entire decade I've been at UMass. So we don't want to focus like a lot of attention on the people entities just yet, but we have them and can work with users if they want them to be more set up and prettied up. And we have yet to test our first stored pipeline. We were in discussions with one publisher, and they said they couldn't provide us the XML that we needed, and that conversation kind of fizzled out. But we're hopeful and looking forward to testing more integrations and automation as we move forward. And here are our email addresses. You can feel free to email us with any questions we haven't answered during our slides, and maybe questions that we won't be able to answer during the Q&A. We're always happy to hop on a Zoom call or answer an email. I'm also happy to share my migration plan document. Basically, I can talk about this for hours and hours and hours. So please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And just a little PS, hot off the presses, and you'll be able to click this link once the slides are shared, that Atmire is developing a digital commons migration guidebook. I'll go back to our contact info and thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Erin, Yunchen, and Steve, for presenting. And I see that we have 2 questions here in our chat. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function that we have here in Zoom. So I'll just go ahead and read the first question. And I see, Yunchen, you already said you would like to answer this question live. So the question is, I think it's supposed to be, are you aware of any scripts to bulk update bitstream policies in DSpace utilizing the API?
Yeah, I was trying to like tap the answer, but I clicked the wrong button because my
Okay.
eyesight's really bad. I can't see that. Sorry. Yes, I think we do have the script to update the policies over there. We basically, you can go to go to the item and then bitstream and update the policy from there. We develop our own script. So if you want to have the script, feel free to reach out to us by the email. I can share that with you, and I can help you to run that on your, on your place.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Yoon Chan's really modest. He developed the script. Don't let me near scripts. So. I will break something for you, but Yoon Chan will fix it.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
The second question is, what standards did you use to implement the subtypes in DC type? What was it based on your types in bepress?
Our types in bepress were basically suppressed, and we didn't know about that article field. In some cases, wait, I'm going to contradict myself because I started talking before my brain caught up. For our ETDs, we had used our type field to indicate whether something was open or restricted. When we did our first feed into our local discovery layer, we realized that that type field then was very misleading. So we had to basically create a new custom type field just because of the way digital commons worked. So our types, again, came through all as articles, or in some cases, if we had done some kind of override with bepress where data did show up as data and article, we had used a lot of the digital commons event structures, so those would show up as events and article. But really, we ended up using, in terms of moving forward, some of the preloaded types that came through the submission forms. And I don't know if that's an Atmire thing or a DSpace thing, just because we're, hosted users. So not entirely sure, but we are trying to standardize those types because they were kind of the Wild West for us.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that, Erin. Another question just came in as a rough ballpark. Does a migration from digital commons to DSpace represent cost savings in your case?
Oh, yes, there was no question. Even with the one-time migration costs for both Janeway and Atmire, it was a substantial savings. Maybe not in terms of labor, but actually what we paid, our vendors. I mean, you do have to acknowledge that there's going to be a point where you're paying multiple vendors at the same time, if you're going with a hosted option, which is the only thing we can do on our campus.
Can you talk a little bit, it's actually a question I had, can you talk a little bit about the team size? How many people did you have working on the project at the same time? Is it the people here? Do you have a larger team?
Well, I kind of sucked Steve into the team because he was my sabbatical coverage. And he also had really great migration experience because UMass had migrated to Folio from Aleph. Well, gosh, that feels like it took forever, but it wasn't that long ago, right? Um, so I didn't let Steve leave when I came back from sabbatical. And we had the support of a metadata librarian, Ann Cardos, who has now gone on to another metadata job at another institution. But she was instrumental in like a lot of the mapping that we did, and also had played a huge role in the folio migration. So just having two people who had done a big migration was really helpful because I knew if either Steve or Anne were anxious about something, then I should be anxious. But otherwise, like it was a very helpful um, to have both of them on the team. We brought Yuntian on after the fact when we needed API and developer support. But really, this is it for us. We're a small but mighty team with two student assistants who also help with uploads and cleanup.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And we have two other questions that just came in. The first one is, how does grad school do ETD review and acceptance now?
All through DSpace, I set up workflow steps so that folks in our graduate student service center, claim something from the DSpace workflow, do the review. The one thing that I wish we could change was that all you can do is reject an item to send it back to the user. So we have to preemptively warn all of our students, like it will say reject. It doesn't mean reject. It means formatting edits are required. Then the student resubmits, the grad school reviews it, and I do the final approval and posting because of our embargo setup. We've added a few kind of yes/no questions for the students to indicate whether or not they want an embargo.
And the second question is, how did you select DSpace? Did you look at Islandora and or Haiku?
Yes. And basically, we felt like our hosting options were more limited. And what I'd heard, like I had talked to a user who had migrated from Digital Commons to Haiku. They ran Haiku locally, but had to pay for developers to do development work for them. That felt complicated. And it was basically when I had talked to a fellow DSpace user who said, Samvera and Haiku are like the shiny, trendy, like convertibles or Ferraris. And DSpace is like the Toyota Corolla of repositories. You know what you're getting. It's meant to be a repository. It's stable. There's a community around it. And that kind of sold it. And we had more hosting options, honestly.
That is an interesting question because I thought about the same thing as you were evaluating. Before you made the migration plan, did you have some sort of rubric where you went through to look at the criteria, or what was your process there?
Oh my gosh, we love task forces. So we had an initial task force before the task force that chose the platform, and it basically identified all the functionality that we needed moving forward, based on kind of documentation, stakeholder feedback, interviews with users. We talked to a lot of DSpace, primarily DSpace users, because we kind of felt in our collective guts that's where we would go. But we did talk to Fedora users and some Haiku Samvera users, and they felt too complicated for us to try to implement. And again, there's the hosting option. Um, I mean, I know that they look very nice, but from everything we learned, they sounded very difficult to manage and run and implement. But I'm always happy to share, like we have so many task force reports. I can share any report. I'd be happy to. And we have a data set, I think, from our stakeholder feedback that we can also share.
Okay, great. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm just going to pause here for a moment to see if there are any more questions that come in. Oh, yeah, just saw one question that just came in. It says, how, if anything, does your DSpace interact with the rest of the 5 colleges?
Oh, I don't know if maybe Steve should speak more about that. Sometimes we're a consortium in name only, I think, in terms of what we share. But if you want to talk more, Steve.
Yeah, so I mean, it's strictly a UMass repository for UMass related items, I'll say. I mentioned we want to get OAI PMH back up because we do have a 5 college discovery system. And we want previously we had the items like all of our stuff from ScholarWorks in that system, and we want to recreate that again, but that has not been a priority either from our end or the discovery end right now. But I think that's something we'll be looking at again shortly, is getting the OAI export working and getting that mapped into the 5 college discovery system.
But I also think it's, we're a big public R1 university and the rest of the other 4 colleges are very small private liberal arts schools. So like we're just a behemoth in comparison. So I think sharing a repository would be a very complicated endeavor. And also like at the policy level too, it would be hard.
Thank you. Okay. Very good. Then we have another question. Any top pain points or successes working with Atmire specifically? Keep in mind we have a few Atmire people here in our attendees today, so but feel free to share anything you would like to share on that question.
I mean, I think that some of the pain points we encountered after going live, like the performance issues, we're not unique in that. And I think that they've been really diligent in helping us troubleshoot like why we were crashing because we were crashing a lot. There are some other questions. I think Steve and I both have tendencies to click things. If we see something clickable, we will click it. And sometimes we're the first people who have ever tried to do something in this version of DSpace that Atmire is hosting. And we'll eventually get an answer, but I think sometimes we surprise them with like, oh, we saw this, so we clicked it and it like broke everything. Why? I think, yeah, don't give me like random buttons to push because I will push them to see what happens. Now I do it in test though. I don't do it in production.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 2 or 3 more minutes here. So just kind of pause another moment to see if there are any other questions. And in the meantime, I'll put in the link in the chat here. As you probably know, this is our main channel for sharing news and updates, and this is where we'll also share the recording and the slides as well. So if you're not subscribed to that Google group, our DSpace community Google group, please feel free to do so to have to get the access to the slides and the recording. Okay, well, if there are no more questions that are coming in, huge thank you to Aaron, Yunchan, and Steve for presenting today. I just saw there's one more question that just came in. Maybe we can still get that in. We have a couple more minutes. Were you minting DOIs in DC with Crossref or DataCite previously?
We're DataCite users, and there was no integration between DataCite and Digital Commons, so it was all external using a script from folks at UNLV. I think it's University of Nevada, Las Vegas, that they had shared.
Awesome. And someone asked, where is the link to the Google group? So in the chat, if you open the chat window, you should be able to see it there. Actually, you know what? Let's see, hosts and panelists. Maybe that didn't work. Let me change this to everyone. That's why. Here we go. I'm gonna re-put it in the chat here. Now you should see it. Sorry, that was my fault. I had sent it to the wrong group. Thank you for alerting me to that. Okay. All right. And we have Solarnaut working on Ubuntu 20.04 for DSpace 6.3. That's more of a comment. So if you have any issues with technical issues with that, please reach out to our technical support group. I can put the link in the chat here as well for that, but that would be a question to ask on the technical support group here that I'll put in the chat. This is the link to that. Okay, yep, you're welcome. So again, thank you very much for presenting today. I think it was a very interesting and informative presentation. It's good to see everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar for the DSpace Deep Dive. I don't know why that's so hard to say, series. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and thanks again to Aaron, Yunqian, and Steve.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.